In these next lectures, I want to take you through 2,500 years of philosophy. I want to take you through 2,500 years of philosophers and what they've thought of works of art and what they thought art was and what the primary components of art were to these philosophers. I've picked and curated a list of about 10 philosophers that we'll go through. So this will give you kind of a broad swath of philosophy of art through the ages and how art and the changing purpose of art changed during this 2,500 years. We'll begin with the ancient Greeks. So as we looked at the Greek lithos, this is a good place for us to begin. So we'll look 2,500 years ago to about 500 BC, about the time when this object was created. One of the items to know about art is primarily before the 20th century, most art was considered to be a contemplation of beauty. Even aesthetics was thought to be the philosophy of what was beautiful. So art was meant to capture the beauty of the world. And if we look at the Greek philosopher Socrates, this was a primary concern of his. There was a moment where someone asked him what was beauty, and he came to this idea that if he could understand what was beautiful and what was not beautiful, then he could understand what was art and what was not art, because art was meant to be the beautiful. So for Socrates, art and beauty were connected. Socrates felt that if he could define beauty and ugly, then he could classify every object as either beautiful or ugly, and every object as an artwork, a work of art, or not a work of art. Now, today, contemporary aesthetics uses other terms other than beauty. In fact, beauty for a while was considered a rather controversial term because most of us even think that, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Each of us is what we see as beautiful might be different for others. But it's kind of fascinating for us to put our heads around this idea that in classical art, it was driven by a desire to produce something that was experienced universally as beautiful. So if we found an image, this shape, the shape of the lithos, was considered to be an idealized form, that everyone who encountered it would see it as a beautiful and pristine shape. If we look at Greek sculptures, they're all designed to have idealized natures. There's even elements in a Greek sculpture, like if we look at the toes of the feet, the Greek ideal was the second toe was longer than the first toe. So we see that even various attributes were all captured in these sculptures because these were idealized forms of beauty. The world has changed so much, and we have a broader and an even conceptual element of what we consider to be conceptually beautiful nowadays. So perhaps today captivating might be a better term. This is Plato. Now, Plato, about 428 to 338 BC. Always know on the test, I'm not going to quiz you or test you on the dates, but they give you an idea of where something falls in a timeline and how art has changed over these millennia. Plato believed that art was imitative of nature, and art was an imitation of the world. So I like to classify Plato as art and imitation. He thought that the emotions and the gestures were simply imitations of the gestures that we see in reality. And he used a special term for this, which he called mimesis. Now, so if something is mimetic, it has imitative qualities. To remember it, sometimes I think of a mime. So a mime is something that is imitating an action. So mimesis. Plato, link him with mimesis, link him with imitation. Now, I can ask you, how is art imitative? Well, if we look at a painting, you can see that this painting is representing something that is of the world. And the part that it's representing is not a real thing in the painting. It is a painting of that thing. So actually for Plato, his famous analogy was to use the analogy of a bed. Now, this confused me when I first started looking at some aesthetics and philosophy books, because there might be a bed on the cover of the book. And I thought, why are we putting a bed on the cover of a book about art? But it comes from this reference and this analogy, which goes all the way back to Plato. That for Plato, a bed was made by a carpenter. And the carpenter based the notion and the idea of the bed on an idealized form and idea of a bed. So somewhere in the carpenter's head was this godlike notion of a bed. And it was something that we could not see as humans, but we could just, the idea of it existed somewhere in the world. And what the carpenter was doing was creating an imitation of the idealized, godlike bed. Now, an artist who painted a bed and made a painting of the bed was then making an imitation of the carpenter's bed, which was an imitation of the idealized bed. So for Plato, art was almost twice removed from the godlike idealized form of a bed. So for Plato, this was the imitation, this was the mimesis. Now, we mentioned that Greek sculpture also imitated idealized beauty. It tried to represent, it tried to touch the idealized form of the human. So it was a contemplation of the beautiful part of the world, and it made us actually more human and better as humans because we could contemplate idealized sense and perhaps become closer to it. So for Plato, he hoped that art would make a more moral and a better society. Now, he also had problems with artists because he thought that the arts should be fine and graceful. Now, fine is a great word to bring up because even in the college, all of you are in the College of Fine Arts. So that fine goes all the way back to Plato. Fine art. What is fine art? And that separates it from the practical arts, the utilitarian arts. Yes, these were the fine arts. They were moving us towards being fine and graceful, and they were moving us towards these idealized moral parts of society, So this, nowadays, it's very different when we say that we can have art for art's sake. So a modernist has a very different idea of the role of art. But for Plato, this was part of the role. In fact, so much so that he realized that artists were powerful people because they could actually inform us and change reality with the pictures that they created and with the art they created. And Plato said that artists could tell lies about the gods with their artwork. He realized that art was a powerful form that could create change, and could disrupt the world. Most artists realize this when we talk about shaking the world up and letting it settle into another existence. So for Plato, artists at one point in his seminal book, Plato's Republic, he declared that the artists were dangerous people and perhaps shouldn't be in this idealized world he called the Republic. Moving forward, this is Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was a scholar who accepted artists. He accepted this idea of imitation and that art was a realistic representation of nature. But he was far friendlier to the artist, and he found art to be far more valuable than Plato did. Aristotle didn't accept this Plato's idea of having a heaven of idealized forms, and rather he thought that the reality, our reality, consisted of the natural world that we sensed. Now, this is a fantastic idea because when we said art is something we can touch, something we can hold, it's something we can see, it's of our senses. So perhaps this idea goes all the way back to Aristotle and his sense that art was capturing the natural world. And he thought that what the artist did was ultimately celebrate nature and ultimately perhaps even complete what nature could not complete. Within the paintings, within the ways we could make further, we could even enhance the celebration of the work and of nature. So the artist created images that amalgamated the very best qualities of nature. And at its best, the best art for Aristotle represented and could become a substitute for the real thing, a symbol for the real thing. We started touching on that with some of the definitions of art as symbolic. Here's a quote by Aristotle that art completes what nature cannot bring to finish. The artist gives us knowledge of nature's unrealized ends. Really wonderful, wonderful thing to say about works of art. Now, for Aristotle, the major word he used with art was catharsis. And Aristotle was highly interested in Greek theater. And he thought that what Greek theater did was it imitated the emotions of the natural world, and it allowed for the release of negative emotions, but in a controlled environment. And this controlled environment, he felt, was really a healthy thing for society. Now, if we think about the play Hamlet, this is a very safe way that we can see these very tragic events unfold, but we know that they're not real. So in that way, we're safe. We can feel them, the actors can feel them, the cathartic elements of the work. And by catharsis, we mean that letting go of emotions, that feeling of emotions, that living in the emotions. We were living in these safe emotions that could be captured in the work. Now, Plato was different than that. He actually, if we think back to him, he thought this wasn't probably not a good thing for us to be living these emotions. And that's one of the reasons he was suspect about the power of art and what art could do to us as human beings. You know, a contemporary idea of this, if we want to think about Plato, we might think of something like people who say that, well, video games are just going to encourage people to act negatively, to act violently, and it's going to cause aggressive behavior. Now, there might be some instances of this, but there's also many people who will say that it too perhaps is a safe environment for getting those things out. and someone who might shoot a bunch of zombies in a video game up might not want to go out into the world and do something similar within the real world. That it is a safe and it's an environment that we know is not a real environment. Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Socrates, let's link him to beauty, that art was beautiful. Aristotle, let's link him to catharsis. Plato, let's link him to imitation and mimesis.